My name is Emily. I am a writer. Last year, I read a French novel called La Débâcle by Émile Zola. It was a long and sad story about war, friendship, and the fall of a country. When I finished it, I sat for a long time in silence. I wanted to tell the story again in simple words so that more people could understand what really happened to Jean and Maurice. It was the year 1870. France was full of fear and hope. People talked about war every day. They said France would win. They believed their army was strong and brave. But no one knew how much pain was waiting for them. Jean Macquart was a simple man. He came from the countryside. He was not rich. He worked hard all his life. He joined the army because he loved his country. Jean was quiet and kind. He cared about people. He was strong, but he was also gentle. Maurice Levasseur was very different. He was young and educated. He came from a family in the city. He liked to read and think. He was full of ideas and dreams. Jean and Maurice met in the army camp. At first, they were not close. Maurice thought Jean was too simple. Jean thought Maurice was too proud. But as days passed, the two men began to understand each other. They shared food, water, and fear. Slowly, a deep friendship grew between them. The soldiers were waiting for orders. They did not know where to go or when to fight. The weather was hot, and the days were long. They were tired, hungry, and confused. Officers gave strange orders. Sometimes they moved forward, then back again. The men did not understand what was happening. They started to lose hope. But they tried to stay brave. One night, Jean sat near the fire. Maurice sat beside him, looking at the dark sky. "Do you think we will win?" Maurice asked. Jean looked at the ground. "I don't know," he said, "but we must keep walking." That simple answer stayed in Maurice's mind. Soon the army began to move. They marched through villages and fields. The people watched them pass and gave them bread and water. Some shouted, "Vive la France!" Others cried because they were afraid. The soldiers smiled, but inside they were worried. They saw the sick and the weak. They saw old men leaving their homes. The war was already touching everyone. The first gunfire came in the early morning. It was loud and close. Jean felt the ground shake. Maurice tried to stay calm, but his hands were cold. They both saw smoke rising from the trees. Men began to shout and run. Some fell to the ground and did not move again. It was Maurice's first time in battle. He was shocked by the noise, the blood, and the fear. Jean tried to protect him. "Stay low," he said. "Do not look too long." The battle did not last long, but it left a mark on everyone. After it ended, Jean and Maurice sat on the ground. They were covered in dust and sweat. Maurice could not speak. He looked at the dead soldiers around him and felt sick. "Is this war?" he whispered. Jean only nodded. They both knew nothing would ever be the same again. As the days passed, The French army kept moving, but no one knew where or why. The generals argued. Some wanted to fight, some wanted to run. The soldiers were lost. They walked for hours without food or water. Sometimes they slept in the rain. Maurice started to write in his small notebook. He wrote about the men, the fear, and the silence. "I do not understand this war," he wrote one night. "We are walking in circles. No one knows where we are going." Jean saw Maurice becoming weaker. He shared his food with him. "Eat," he said. "You need strength." Maurice smiled sadly. "You are a good man, Jean," he said. "Maybe the best man I know." From that moment, Jean felt he had to protect Maurice like a brother. One evening, they reached a small village. The people there were poor and tired. They had seen soldiers before. The women gave them water. The children watched with big eyes. An old man said, "You cannot win. The enemy is too strong." The soldiers looked away. No one wanted to believe him. That night, Maurice could not sleep. He looked at Jean, who was already asleep on the cold ground. "He is strong," Maurice thought. "He believes in duty. I believe in ideas. But maybe duty is stronger than ideas." The next morning, they heard new orders. They were told to move toward a place called Sedan. The men did not know that Sedan would change everything. They walked through fields full of smoke. They saw villages burning. They saw mothers crying for their sons. Maurice felt a pain in his heart. He had never seen such suffering. As they came closer to Sedan, they saw the Prussian army everywhere. The enemy had more men, more guns, and more food. The French soldiers were trapped. Jean looked at the hills and said quietly, "We are in a cage." Maurice felt his hands shake. "Maybe we can still fight," he said. Jean looked at him sadly. "We can fight, but we cannot win." That day, the sky was gray. The smell of smoke was in the air. The battle began again. Cannons roared. Horses screamed. Men shouted for help. Jean and Maurice ran side by side. They were afraid, but they did not stop. They tried to hold their line, but it was too late. Everything was chaos. The sound of war filled the air like thunder. Hours later, the shooting stopped. The men were quiet. The air was full of dust and death. Maurice sat on the ground, shaking. "Is this the end?" he asked. Jean looked at the flag of France lying in the mud. "Not yet," he said, but his eyes were full of tears. That night, they sat together again, tired and broken. Maurice whispered, "I thought war was glory. I thought it was about honor, but it is only pain." Jean put his hand on his shoulder. "You are learning what I already knew," he said. "War eats everything. Land, men, hope." The next morning they heard the news. The French army was defeated. The emperor was taken. France had fallen. Maurice felt his chest tighten. Jean closed his eyes. Around them, men cried, prayed, or stayed silent. It was over. But for Jean and Maurice, the real suffering had just begun. That was how their story started. In confusion, in fear, and in friendship. When I read that part of the novel, I felt the same sadness they felt. I could see them walking through the smoke and mud, still holding on to each other. They were not heroes. They were just two men in a war they did not choose. And that is where I will stop for now. Before I continue rest of the story, please like, subscribe, share, and tell me where you are listening from. Your support means a lot to me. Now let's continue. When I opened the next part of Zola's story, I felt a cold wind in my heart. The war had already broken France. But the story of Jean and Maurice was not finished. It was only beginning to show how pain can live inside the human soul. After the Battle of Sedan, everything changed. The French army was gone. Many soldiers were dead. Many were missing. Some tried to run, but they had nowhere to go. The Prussian army closed every road. Jean and Maurice sat on the ground with hundreds of tired men. They were dirty, hungry, and lost. Maurice could not stop looking at the hills. "It is over," he whispered. "We are finished." Jean looked at him quietly. "No," he said. "We are alive. That means we can still do something." But his voice was heavy. He knew they could not escape. Soon the enemy soldiers came. They took their guns and food. They made the French soldiers walk to the town of Sedan. People stood by the road to watch them pass. Some cried. Others turned away. The men walked slowly like shadows. Maurice felt his legs shake. He had never felt so weak. Jean walked beside him and held his arm. "Keep walking," he said softly. "One step at a time." They were kept in a big field near the river. Thousands of men were there, sitting on the wet ground. They had no tents, no food, no hope. The smell of sickness filled the air. The sky was gray and rain started to fall. Maurice sat with his head in his hands. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked. "Why must people die like this?" Jean did not answer. He looked at the river and thought about home. After a few days, the Prussians let some men go. Others were sent to camps far away. Jean and Maurice stayed together. They became closer than before. They shared what little food they had. Sometimes they only had one piece of bread for 2 people. Jean always gave the bigger part to Maurice. Maurice did not want to take it, but Jean said, "You must eat. You think too much. You need strength." When France lost the war, the emperor was taken to Germany. The country had no leader. In Paris, people were angry. They shouted for freedom and change. Some wanted peace. Some wanted revenge. The country was broken inside. Jean and Maurice were finally free after many months. They walked back to France. The land was empty. Fields were burned. Houses were gone. In every village they saw women wearing black clothes. They were widows who had lost their husbands and sons. Children stood by the road and watched them. Though one smiled. In one small town, Jean found some work on a farm. He helped a widow repair her fence. Maurice stayed with him. He wanted to write again. He filled a notebook with his thoughts. "I cannot forget what I saw," he wrote. "It is like a fire in my mind." Jean worked quietly every day. He did not talk much, but his eyes were kind. Maurice changed. He was not the same young man he had been. He talked about justice, freedom, and revenge. He wanted to fight again, but this time not for the emperor, for France itself. Jean did not like this new anger. He said, "War does not bring peace, Maurice. It only brings more graves." But Maurice did not listen. Months passed, and they heard news from Paris. The city was under siege. The people had no food. They were eating horses and rats to survive. Then, after the surrender, something new began. People in Paris rose up against their own leaders. They called it La Commune. They said they wanted a new France, fair and free. Maurice became excited. "This is our chance," he said. "We can build a new country." He wanted to go to Paris. Jean was afraid. "Do not go," he said. "The fighting will start again. You will die for nothing." But Maurice could not stop himself. He believed this was the moment to change everything. One cold morning, Maurice left. Jean tried to stop him, but he said, "I must go. This time I fight for the people, not for kings." Jean watched him walk away. He felt something heavy in his heart. Weeks later, Jean heard terrible news. The French army was now fighting against the people of Paris. Brother against brother. The city was burning. Jean could not stay. He went to Paris to find Maurice. The city was full of smoke and fear. Soldiers fought in the streets. Buildings were on fire. The smell of gunpowder was everywhere. Jean walked for hours, calling Maurice's name. He saw bodies on the ground. He saw mothers holding their dead children. He had never seen such sadness. Then, one afternoon, he saw Maurice again. But this time, Maurice was wearing the red band of the Commune. He was one of the rebels. Their eyes met across the street. For a moment, time stopped. Maurice looked at Jean with surprise. "You came?" he shouted. "Why?" Jean walked closer. "To bring you home." Maurice shook his head. "Home? There is no home now. Only France. And France must change." They argued in the middle of the broken street. The sound of gunfire came closer. Jean begged him to stop. "Maurice, this is madness. You are fighting your own people." Maurice shouted back, "They are not my people. They are traitors! They left us to die at Sedan." His voice was full of pain and anger. The soldiers came. There was more shooting. People screamed. Jean tried to pull Maurice away, but a bullet hit the wall near them. They ran to hide behind some stones. Maurice was breathing fast. "I cannot stop now," he said. "This is for all we lost." Jean looked at him sadly. "You have already lost too much." The days in Paris grew darker. The army began to win. The rebels were tired and hungry. One morning, Jean woke to the sound of heavy guns. The city was falling. He ran to find Maurice again. He found him near a burning building, trying to help a wounded man. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Maurice fell to the ground. Jean caught him before he hit the street. Maurice looked up at Jean. His face was pale. "John," he whispered. "It was all for nothing." Jean held him close. "No, my brother," he said softly. "You fought for what you believed." "That is not nothing." Maurice smiled weakly. "I am tired," he said. "Tell France to forgive us." Then his eyes closed and he was gone. Jean stayed there for a long time. The city burned around him. He did not cry. His face was calm, but his heart was broken. He buried Maurice in a quiet place near the river. Then he walked away from Paris, alone. When I read that part of the story, I had to stop. I could feel Jean's pain like it was my own. Zola showed not only the death of one man, but the death of a whole country. France lost its pride, its peace, and its hope. And yet, there was still something human in Jean's silence. The small, quiet love between two men who met in war and stayed brothers until the end. After Maurice's death, Jean walked away from Paris. The city was full of smoke and broken dreams. Every street had blood on the stones. Houses were black from fire. People walked slowly, as if they had lost their souls. Jean did not look back. He felt that nothing good could come from looking back. He walked for days without food. He passed empty farms and burned villages. The war had touched everything. Even the birds were gone. He slept in barns and under trees. His boots were torn. His face was thin. But still, he walked. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he had to move. Sometimes he heard church bells in the distance. Sometimes he met other soldiers. Some were angry. Some were lost. Some were mad. Jean helped one man who had a bad wound. He tore a piece of his shirt to stop the bleeding. The man said, "Why do you help me?" Jean said quietly, "Because you are still alive." Days turned into weeks. Jean found a small village far from Paris. There was peace there, or at least something close to it. The people were afraid of soldiers, but Jean was gentle. He helped them fix a roof, cut wood, and bring water from the well. Little by little, they started to trust him. An old woman gave him a bed in her barn. Her name was Marie. She had lost her 2 sons in the war. One died in battle, the other never came home. She said, "I used to wait for letters. Now I wait for nothing." Jean listened and said, "I lost my friend too. His name was Maurice." Marie looked at him kindly. "Then you know my pain," she said. Every evening, Jean sat outside and looked at the sunset. The sky turned red and gold. He thought about the past, the sound of guns, the voice of Maurice, the faces of the men who never came back. Sometimes he closed his eyes and could still hear Maurice laughing by the fire in the camp. He wished he could go back to that time before everything fell apart. One day, Jean took out the small notebook that Maurice used to carry. He found it in his coat after the battle. The pages were wet and dirty, but some words were still clear. Maurice had written about dreams, freedom, and hope. "France will rise again," one line said. Jean touched the words with his fingers. He whispered, "I hope you are right." Years passed. Jean stayed in the village. He worked in the fields and helped rebuild houses. He never married. He did not talk much, but everyone respected him. When people asked about the war, he said little. "It was a time of great pain," he would say. "We lost much, but we must keep living." Sometimes children asked him about the man in the notebook. He said, "His name was Maurice. He was my friend. He wanted to change the world." The children listened with big eyes. One boy asked, "Did he win?" Jean smiled sadly. "No," he said, "but he tried." In spring, flowers grew over the graves near the church. Jean often went there. He did not know where Maurice was buried exactly, but he liked to think that the flowers reached him somehow. He spoke softly, as if Maurice could still hear him. "You wanted a better world," he said. "Maybe it will come one day." When I read this last part, I felt something deep inside me. Zola did not write only about war. He wrote about what it means to be human, to lose, to love, to hope again after everything is gone. Jean was not a hero. He was just a man who learned to keep walking even when his heart was heavy. The story of Jean and Maurice is not about victory. It is about survival. It is about friendship that stays alive even after death. It is about how one life can change another. Maurice gave Jean a reason to keep living, and Jean gave Maurice a chance to be remembered. Sometimes I think about them when I see the world now. We still fight wars. We still forget what pain looks like. But maybe stories like this remind us that every soldier, every name, is a person with a heart. At the end of La Debacle, Jean stands in a field as the sun rises. The air is cold. The light touches his face. He feels the world moving again. He whispers, "It is over now." But deep down, he knows it never really is. The memories will stay forever. But he also knows that life, somehow, continues. When I closed the book, I cried a little. I thought of all the people who lived and died in that time. I thought of Jean, still walking, still believing that kindness matters. That is what Zola wanted us to see, that even when everything falls, a small part of goodness can survive. And so, this is the story of Jean and Maurice, two men in a lost war, two hearts broken by the same country they loved. But through their pain, we see something greater, the strength to stay human when the world forgets what that means. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe to English Medium Stories. Stay with us for more classic stories in easy English.